You heard the reading just a moment ago. The entire chapter of Luke chapter 14 is devoted to really dinner stories, luncheon lessons from Jesus. And we'll talk about that. The first verse of this chapter tells us the setting that Jesus has been invited to dinner again. This is the third time in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus has accepted an invitation by a Pharisee to dinner. Says a leader of the Pharisees, no doubt. Once again, he's going to be, as Jesus always was, a ready person, ready to come to dinner, but also by the time it was over, he might insult you in the process before he left. So he was a sketchy host to dinner. You never knew what was going to come out of Jesus' mouth when he showed up. Before I get into the text, I was thinking about this story and these luncheon lessons and dinner stories. My mother-in-law taught me how to eat. She did. No, not literally eat. How to eat properly. My wife and I attended a Christian college in Nashville called Welch College, and 2 times a year the school had a formal dinner. My mother-in-law, Regina's mother, was a dean. Part of her responsibilities, she had many more, much more significant than this, was she held a kind of a seminar each semester on how to eat properly on formal occasions. You know, which fork to use, what to do with your silverware after you're finished with the meal, which way to pass items around the table. Of course, how to properly seat a guest and so forth. All these things. She taught me dinner etiquette. As a matter of fact, my first date with Regina was on February the 14th, 1987, to one of those formal dinners. So in reality, all my mother-in-law was doing was trying to keep me from embarrassing her daughter at the dinner. Dinner etiquette. We're going to see today where Jesus shares some of his own divine dinner etiquette in these stories. They're really stories that are intended to help us understand how Jesus was different from the kind of run-of-the-mill religious establishment of the day, especially as he interpreted what was important in life. And I'll note that while the gospel reading today skipped it, we also find in chapter 14 another occasion where Jesus heals someone on the Sabbath. Very similar to what we talked about last week. That was, matter of fact, his 4th Sabbath controversy story in the Gospel of Luke. So we're well along in the narrative. Jesus is moving toward Jerusalem, but he takes time to attend a dinner at a leader of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, they do not get good press in the Gospels. As a matter of fact, the word Pharisee has become, in many people's mind, a synonym for hypocrite, because Jesus so often pointed out some of the hypocrisies he saw in the way they talked about God and faith. The Pharisees were actually fairly well admired in Jesus' world. They were extremely strict. They were deeply concerned about honoring God by honoring the Torah, the law. They even had a set of oral and developing traditions about how to make sure that they would even further remove themselves from any possibility that they would break the law. And the Sabbath law being so important, as I mentioned last week, they especially had a lot of rules and regulations about how you were to behave on the Sabbath. So when once again Jesus heals a man who is suffering from some sort of fluid retention, either in his joints and extremities, we don't exactly know what it was because we didn't have a modern medical doctor to go back and diagnose what was going on here. But in the story, Jesus heals this individual and once again provokes the religious leaders with the question of what's appropriate to do on the Sabbath again. And again, points out that, hey, if you would help your child, or the translation may have been your donkey or your oxen out of a pit or a well on the Sabbath, certainly you would do that. Then why wouldn't you want to help a man who had been suffering from an ailment that brought him perhaps great pain to his body, where he had never really experienced, at least for some time, what it meant to truly rest on the Sabbath? So once again, Jesus kind of prods and pokes the leaders of the Pharisees and the lawyers, the religious experts, with that question. But he is attending dinner, and he begins to watch what's going on at the dinner party, the luncheon after the Sabbath synagogue meeting. So he's at this home of apparently some very prominent Pharisees, perhaps others, who have been invited over to dinner. And Jesus begins to watch. And this is one of those occasions I cannot help but think Jesus told this part of the story, this parable, with a twinkle in his eye, because he's watching everybody perhaps jostling for the chief seats, the most important seats, the seats of honor at this luncheon, this dinner party. And if you've ever been to a formal occasion, perhaps you've been to an occasion where there have been people up on the stage and people who are trying to get the best seats in the house, you know, the closest to the host, the places of honor. You can imagine how this can work, okay? These are apparently not assigned seats so far, at least early on. So the people who show up early think, I'm going to get one of the best seats, the seats of honor, where everybody will look at me and they'll say, wow, look, that person's up close to the host. They must be really, really important. Well, Jesus is standing back and he is watching this go on. And I can imagine where someone has been, well, how shall I say it? They've overestimated their value to the host and have been invited to go and take a lower place of honor in the forum for the luncheon, for the dinner. And Jesus perhaps sees this and he says, hey, you know, and by the way, Jesus didn't invent this insight. You find it in Proverbs chapter 24, verses 6 and 7, where a very similar proverb, an ancient Jewish proverb, was told about this very thing. And what does Jesus say? He says, listen, when you go into a dinner or a wedding banquet or a special occasion, don't just march up to the front to the best seats in the house and acquire it to yourself. Why? Because someone might come along and say, excuse me, this seat's been assigned to someone more distinguished than you, but we've got a place for you back here in the back corner. Jesus is saying that would be terribly embarrassing to have that kind of thing happen if you've ever done that. Maybe you've gone to a baseball game, you thought you'd get a little closer to the field, and the usher comes along and say, hey, you're in the wrong seat, you got to go up into the upper deck. Someone who paid a higher price for the ticket is going to sit here. It's embarrassing to have something like that happen, especially on a formal occasion where everybody's there to kind of, you know, impress one another. Does this happen with human beings? We are, I think, without contradiction, the most status-focused species on the planet. Sure, there are hierarchies in other species, but people, human beings, are very conscious of status. We keep ranks, right? We rank things. We rank ourselves. We have notions about who is upper, middle, lower class. We have these notions in our mind, and we're very conscious in it. Arguably, most of the things that people buy that other people will see are purchased at least with status consciousness in mind. Is this not true? We all have a touch of this. When we go into a formal setting where people are important, are perceived to be important, we're conscious of how we're ranked. And Jesus warns us, and this is a practical insight, by the way, just an old Jewish proverb, and Jesus chooses this occasion to look out at these people, apparently prominent people, and say, hey, look, don't embarrass yourself. Take the lowest seat. Take the seat of least honor, because you will be far more impressive if they go to you in the seat of least honor, and they say, hey, look, I don't want to sit here. We have the best seat, the most honorable place for you. Come up here and sit. And then everybody will see you, and they'll say, wow, that person must be really, really important to the guest. Now, that's a practical insight for anybody. And you can even have low motives for doing it. I'm sure people have. False humility is such a thing too, right? But what is Jesus trying to convey here? He's trying to convey the spirit of humility and how important it is to be humble. Not only for the way to practically keep from embarrassing yourself in a formal occasion, but also as a cultivated way of life. Jesus says there, and you remember a proverb he said before, a statement he said before, those that exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The idea that we are to live the kind of life where we cultivate within ourselves the values of being humble and kind, of not just looking out for our own interest, not just being concerned about our own status, about getting honor for ourselves, but when we walk into a room, the first concern there is not to one-up everyone else, but rather to be there and experience people without feeling like we need to put someone beneath us. That is a temptation for all of us as humans. We have to fight it. We have to resist it. Jesus says, don't do this. Avoid the embarrassment, but even more importantly, cultivate humility. We all battle as human beings with a natural self-interest. The problem with self-interest, we need self-interest, by the way. Self-interest gets us up in the morning. It usually helps us clean up a bit in the morning before we go out and present ourselves to the public. Self-interest causes us to look for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Self-interest will often encourage us to go to work when we probably would rather not. Self-interest is, on balance, pretty good. But we all have this capacity within ourselves to allow our natural self-interest to devolve into self-absorption, to where we begin to think we're not only the most important person in our world, we're the most important person, or should be, in everybody else's world. If you don't know that's true, you probably weren't driving around looking for hurricane supplies this past week. I was in Sam's Club, I was picking up some things, and they had a little water there, and I was going to get a little water, you know. I mean, everybody else was doing it. And I was talking to the lady, and we were just jabbering on about the line. There was a little line. It's a very short line. I said, well, things seem to be pretty calm today. She says, yeah, but you should have been here yesterday. People were arguing and fussing and fighting and elbowing one another for water, all right? A lot of people have a lot of water that they will hopefully not need to use this week. Maybe they'll store it so there'll be fewer fusses and fights next time. But if you're looking for water, you're looking for gas, you're looking for propane this past week, you're looking for all kinds of goods. You thought the bread, I bought bread this week that I'd never bought before. Ralph, I've checked out at Publix there, Ralph, where you were working, and I checked out, and I said, this is hurricane bread. In other words, I'd never bought this bread, or never eat bread like this, if it weren't for the possibility there's a hurricane coming. Anna says it's the most dense bread I've ever purchased, huh?
Did you like it?
Well, Anna ate some of it. I'm not going to touch it unless a hurricane comes. But we have it within us to be self-absorbed to the point that we just simply care about ourselves above all others. Jesus says cultivate humility. But that's not the only dinner story that Jesus told. He had another luncheon lesson. And the first one is directed toward his host. Toward the other guest. The second one is directed toward the host of the party, the leader of the Pharisees. And Jesus says to him, and this is after this first comment, he addressed the host by telling him that for future luncheons, the Pharisee should not simply invite his family, friends, and rich neighbors, but rather the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. I told you it was dangerous to invite Jesus over for dinner. Pharisees should have known. This is, after all, the fourth time he's been invited over. Every time he comes over, he ends up insulting the host. Word should have traveled along. I've read that the number of Pharisees in Jesus' day was only no more than 6,000. You'd think word would have traveled. And by the way, this is the last invitation he gets from a Pharisee in the storyline of Luke's gospel. But here he is even instructing the host on who he ought to invite. So what's happening? Well, obviously, the leader of the Pharisees has invited all the local dignitaries, the people who are distinguished, the people that the host wants to not only impress, but there also is the possibility of payback, right? Because you invite wealthy, nice people that you want to impress over to your dinner. They'll come, and then in the future, they'll return the favor, right? That's kind of the way it works, right? You have dinner parties for all your wonderful friends and your rich neighbors and the other religious leaders you want to impress, and you have a grand old time. These dinner parties were pretty popular. Apparently, they had in part been picked up from the Greeks who had the symposium, where they would gather together and they would have wine and good food, and they would sit around and they would talk philosophy, politics, or religion. This was going to be one of those occasions. So you didn't want any of these undesirable people there, right? These people you had to make special accommodations for because they were poor, they were crippled, they were lame, they were blind. Those kind of people take extra effort. Jesus says to the host, when you schedule a dinner party, don't just invite the people who can pay you back in this life. Invite the kind of people that you'll only get a repayment, if you ever do, in the life to come. He says they're repaid in the resurrection. That's what he's referring to. Repaid by God, not by fellow human beings. And he focuses on people that had been a focus of Jesus' ministry his entire time. The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the people who do not have the physical or mental, in some cases, abilities to help themselves. He wanted to open up in a way of radical hospitality to include people who normally weren't on the guest list, to make sure they were cared for. The people who were not fat and happy, but the people who were often lean and hungry. You see, Jesus is at a party, and instead of being impressed with the status of everyone there, Jesus immediately begins to think about all the people out there who would be better served by a good meal who weren't there. Radical hospitality. In our own individual lives and our lives as a community of faith, I think we'll always be a people that have places at the table for the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. I think we try to at our congregation. If you come to a meal here, you're just as likely to be sitting by a person who we might call homeless or somebody who suffers from food insecurity at our church. I hope it's always like that. We always want to cultivate that spirit, because when we look around at one another and we feel good, and this is what happens when you have a little wealth, you have a little means, you like to hobnob with other people who have a little wealth and a little means. People won't embarrass you or make you look bad when the guest list shows up. That's what we tend to want as human beings. But Jesus says on our guest list, we should put at the top of it the people who cannot help themselves and who are often on the outside looking in at our circles of wealth and happiness and satisfaction. Radical hospitality. So those two qualities, humility and hospitality, humility and radical hospitality, are the essence of what Jesus envisioned when he talked about the kingdom of God. Because he'll go on to tell one other dinner story that I'm not going into depth about today, where he moves beyond the here and now to the vision of the kingdom of God as being a great feast, a great banquet. And some of the people who show up there will be a surprise to you. And some of the people that will be missing there will be a surprise to you for a totally different reason. Because God does not look at human beings the way we do. We are prone to look at people in terms of status. Are they like us? Do we feel comfortable with them? Do they have the same socioeconomic value in our society? If we're not careful, we'll fall into that trap. But Jesus says, and he always did this, he was always thinking about the people that were forgotten. And to follow Jesus and to truly embrace his kingdom, we can never get satisfied in our own little enclave of wealth and status while forgetting those who are outside looking in, just wishing they had a little bit of the good life. That is Jesus' divine dinner etiquette. May we always practice it ourselves.